The Biden administration and Democrats are doubling down on seizing resources from American families and diverting them to support illegal migrants. It's not surprising, given the administration's track record. Their refusal to enforce immigration laws and their elimination of deterrence tools and asylum agreements have been catastrophic. Over 2 million people have crossed the southern border illegally in 2023 alone, with drug runners, human smugglers, terrorists, and other nefarious wrongdoers taking advantage of our porous border. The consequences are far-reaching. While border communities have suffered the brunt of the uncontrolled influx for too long, the impact is no longer isolated. Cities and communities across the country are overwhelmed and facing the challenges of housing and providing services to the influx of migrants. It's led to questionable decisions. For example, in New York City, Mayor Eric Adams sought to house some of these individuals on land owned by the National Park Service. The Biden administration agreed, and recently a migrant encampment opened at Floyd Bennett Field, a unit of the National Park System. The decision to use these facilities not only conflicts with the National Park Service's mission and with federal law, but it also raises serious safety concerns both for those who would be housed there and for those who live nearby. Citizens shouldn't suffer the loss of access to national parks and lands because of the Biden administration's destructive immigration policies. That's why we're taking up H.R. 5283, protecting our communities from failure to secure the Border Act of 2023. This bill would not only reverse the decision to lease Park Service land to New York City for the purpose of housing illegal immigrants, but it would also draw a clear line prohibiting the Biden administration from doing so with any federal lands in the future. Instead of prioritizing those who have violated our laws, this White House needs to focus on securing our border and fixing a strained system. This bill is an actionable step in showing our communities that they are not forgotten. Today's hearing will also cover S.J. Res. 32, a resolution disapproving of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's proposed rule regarding small business lending. As we've seen time and time again, President Biden's administration is enamored with pushing one-size-fits-all regulations from Washington. The regulation at issue is no different. It implements Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which requires the CFPB to collect data on small business lending. In practical terms, it expands the reach of federal bureaucrats to the detriment of American families and small businesses. Make no mistake, inundating community banks, including lenders making just 100 loans per year with layers of new paperwork requirements and compliance costs, won't safeguard consumers. It will have a chilling effect on smaller mom-and-pop banks while also raising significant privacy concerns. I've witnessed the effects of similar regulatory efforts firsthand. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to visit one of the local banks in my district. The president of the bank brought me in a room with 8 desks. He explained that these desks were occupied by people whose sole job was compliance with the Dodd-Frank Act. While these were good, hardworking employees, the problem was clear. These were new employees that he had to bring on exclusively to comply with reporting requirements. They didn't help meet the needs of small businesses or bank customers. They only increase costs, which inevitably will be absorbed by consumers. If the CFPB's measure is enacted, local and community banks, like the one in my district, will have to bring on more people just to report data to Washington. With high inflation and interest rates already making it harder to make ends meet, the last thing Main Street needs is another regulation that makes it more difficult for them to get the credit they need. S.J. Res. 32 will support our small businesses, who are job creators and pillars of our economy. Finally, the committee will also resume consideration of H.R. 5961, the No Funds for Iranian Terrorism Act. When we took this bill up prior to recess, we heard concerns from members that they wanted an opportunity to consider amendments to this measure. We are meeting today to afford those members that opportunity. I'll now yield to my good friend, our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I hope everyone had a nice Thanksgiving, spent with family, friends, giving back, and hopefully much less arguing than what has gone on in these last few months here in the Congress. That said, we are back today to consider three bills that, once again, don't do anything to solve the problems that matter most to our constituents. After weeks of fighting amongst themselves, House Republicans still haven't gotten the memo. Instead of lowering costs for everyday people or bringing good-paying jobs back to America or passing comprehensive legislation to keep communities safe and thriving, they're focused on culture wars and trying to advance bills that they couldn't even get on the House floor the first time. H.R. 5283 targets federal funding that helps support temporary shelters for certain non-citizens, including migrants seeking asylum. This bill fails to address the humanitarian crisis or security needs at our border and will never become law. S.J. Res. 32 would reverse a rule that aims to increase opportunity for underserved small businesses like family farms and minority-owned businesses. This CRA faces strong opposition since it threatens steps to improve transparency and fairness in small business lending. H.R. 5961 is a bill to force the U.S. to go back on the recent prisoner swap with Iran and bar Iranian funds held abroad from being used to purchase food and medicine. Not only is this bad policy, this committee already reported a rule for it, which failed on the House floor. I mean, come on. Since taking the majority in January, House Republicans have only exhibited incompetence and chaos. We wasted 20 days this year, waiting for House Republicans to stop fighting with each other long enough to elect this speaker. The House was held hostage for days in June because a tiny extreme faction of the Republican conference chose to throw a fit over the debt deal negotiated by President Biden and then Speaker McCarthy. They struck down a rule on the floor for the first time in over decades, holding the House floor schedule hostage holding the House floor schedule hostage, all for camera time and to push their conference even further to the right. Since then, we've seen three more rule votes fail this Congress. The record is 5. I'm no fortune teller, but given that 4 rules have failed this year and we are less than halfway through the 118th Congress, I'd say this Republican majority is on track to break that record. We have also seen over 40 closed rules on the floor this year, 40. And for the Rules Committee, that have been structured open rules, 68% of all bipartisan amendments submitted have been blocked. Hell, over half of Republican amendments have been blocked by their own leadership. And to clarify for everyone watching, there hasn't been a single open rule since this Republican majority took over, despite what my friends across the aisle claimed when the House rules package first passed. According to House Republicans, I may take that back. I think you had one open rule since we began. According to House Republicans, this legislative process for the 118th Congress was supposed to be the most open, most transparent, and most inclusive of all Congresses. Yet, they haven't made good on the promise. In fact, they really haven't made good on most of their promises. One of our Republican colleagues on this committee took to the House floor and said as much, and I quote, "Nothing but empty promises," he went on to say. "We haven't done anything. One thing. I want my Republican colleagues to give me one thing. One, that I can go campaign on and say we did. One, anybody sitting in the complex, if you want to come down to the floor and come explain to me one material, meaningful, significant thing the Republican majority has done," end quote. My colleague was here a minute ago, but maybe he's back down on the floor waiting for somebody to tell him the one thing that the Republican majority has accomplished. The sheer incompetence and the chaos that we've seen this year, members of Congress physically tussling in the hallways, threatening to fight witnesses, holding the floor hostage, all of it. Enough is enough. And all I can say with the utmost respect for the chairman is that none of this falls on your shoulders. I think you've tried your best with the hand you've been dealt. You've run this committee as smoothly as possible. And the key here is that I know everything you do is to try to make this institution better. Unlike some in this body, you don't want to dismantle and destroy. You want to make this institution stronger. I just wish that other members would join you and get on the same page. Then, just maybe, we could work together and get something big done for the American people. And with that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our first panel, Chairman Bruce Westerman and Ranking Member Raul Grijalva from the Committee on Natural Resources. Chairman Westerman, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern. Appreciate the opportunity to be here to testify. H.R. 5283 revokes a lease signed by the Biden administration to turn a unit of the National Park System over to New York City for the purpose of constructing a migrant tent city and prevent any further funding from being used to construct housing facilities or lease lands for housing facilities for illegal migrants on federal lands. Our national parks have rightly been called many things, including America's best idea. What they have never been called and should never be called is home to thousands of migrants who have come to our country illegally. If this sounds absurd to you, it's because it is. And yet, it's exactly what the Biden administration did earlier this fall when they signed a legally dubious lease to house more than 2,000 illegal migrants at National Park Unit property in New York City. When my friend from New York, Congresswoman Malliotakis, called me with this disturbing news in August, I thought it was unbelievable. She told me that the Biden administration was working to build a camp for illegal immigrants in a national park unit, and they had come to survey an area in her district along with others in the greater New York City area. Just a few weeks later, I went to New York for a site visit with Representative Malliotakis and Representative Gosar, who chairs the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of the Natural Resources Committee. We visited Floyd Bennett Field, which is a historic section of the Gateway National Recreation Area, a unit of the National Park Service. We were told Floyd Bennett Field was being evaluated as a location for housing illegal migrants. Notably, when we first heard about this issue in August, the issue of housing illegal migrants on Park Service land was supposedly a rumor. However, when we arrived at Floyd Bennett Field on September 18th, a lease had already been signed between the National Park Service and the City of New York 3 days earlier on September 15th. During our site visit, we met with National Park Service and Emergency Management Service officials who detailed their plans to turn the park into a tent city for migrants. A tent city, I should note, located next to a campground, a playground, an ice skating rink, and a military training facility that includes live munitions in an active flood zone. Here we are today, about 2 months later, and despite local outrage, as well as lawsuits filed by elected officials in New York City on both sides of the aisle, the migrant camp is open for business with tent shelters constructed for 2,000 individuals. On November 12th, the day the Floyd Bennett Field Migrant Camp opened, busloads of migrants arrived, and after setting eyes on the site, the majority of them immediately left. News reports indicate the migrants wanted nothing to do with the shelter and cited the remote and undesirable accommodations as to why they left. It is my understanding there are currently about 500 people living in the facility. I want to stress how quickly this action by the Biden administration moved. The evaluation and construction of this facility was not normal operations for the federal government or the National Park Service. Anybody who is familiar with NEPA knows that it can take years or even decades for projects to get the necessary approvals. And yet, in a matter of a few short weeks, this lease was signed, housing facilities constructed, and migrants are now living in the camp. But don't take my word for it. Listen to what the Legal Aid Society said earlier this month, and I quote, "Placing families with children at Floyd Bennett Field is a recipe for disaster. The city must abandon its misguided effort," end quote. If that's not enough for you, how about the Coalition for the Homeless, who said, quote, "Enormous tents filled with tiny cubicles in what feels like the middle of nowhere is not in any way an appropriate setting for families with kids. It's really unimaginable that anyone thought this was a good idea," end quote. And I would like to submit the full statements from these organizations into the record along with the testimony. The Natural Resources Committee received in opposition to this proposal from elected Democrats and Republican leaders from New York City, the U.S. Park Police Union, and several news articles about this issue. This isn't just about protecting our parks. This is also a safety issue for the local community. As I mentioned earlier, the tent facility is located right next to a playground. The park police have already testified that they do not have the manpower to patrol this area and that safety is a huge concern. Local parents are so concerned they've already pulled their kids out of a local Sea Cadets program at Floyd Bennett Field. If we allow this to happen in New York City, what's to stop the administration from expanding this model and housing migrants at the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone or even Minuteman National Historic Park in the ranking member's home state? I encourage the committee to report a favorable rule that supports this legislation, which would revoke this misguided lease and prevent any further funding from being used to construct facilities or lease lands for housing facilities for illegal migrants on federal lands. This bill is vital to protecting our parks and communities from bearing the brunt of the Biden border crisis. Thank you, and I'm ready to answer questions at any time.
Thank you very much. Representative Cahalvo, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cole and Ranking Member McGovern and members of the committee. We just returned, as we all know, from our Thanksgiving break. And unfortunately, it seems that one of the first bills up for consideration immediately leaves behind the grace, the humility, and the benevolence associated with that American tradition. We should be looking to the humanity of the indigenous people who sat down with those early refugees, the migrants who came here looking for a better life and to leave persecution behind. And they chose to welcome, to share, and to give thanks. Instead, we're taking up H.R. 5283, which is a stunt and a distraction that uses today's migrant real crisis to divide us and to score empty political points. We're told this bill is necessary to protect national parks and public lands. Nothing could be further from the truth. The bill is about the polls and elections, not providing resources, and not about providing resources to the National Park Service or protecting our public lands. As was mentioned, there are about 20 days in session left until the government runs out of funding. Yes, for anybody that has been watching this, that's right. We are once again just weeks away from yet another Republican shutdown. Republicans should be spending this valuable time passing serious bills that will keep the government operational, address the climate crisis, and even work toward comprehensive immigration reform. Instead, we're considering a bill to revoke New York City's lease for Floyd Bennett Field and to prohibit housing immigrants on public lands. At best, this is a distraction. At worst, the extreme MAGA wing of the Republican Party will hear this as a dog whistle that advances xenophobic rhetoric, dehumanizes asylum seekers, and attempts to justify a cruel rewrite of immigration standards. And that rewrite is very real. Just months ago, Stephen Miller, the former advisor to President Trump and currently working on that campaign as well, talked about when we're in charge again, what will we do on the issue of immigration? It talked about mass deportation, about mass roundups, about mass incarceration, about ending asylum laws, about ending DACA and that protection under executive order, about creating a crisis of domestic proportions that we haven't seen in this country. Yes, that's the rewrite of the immigration standards. And this particular legislation is a precursor to the kind of discussion that will lead us to more division and more fear in this country of ours. It would be a lot easier for me to take the supposed concerns of our national parks and public lands seriously if House Republicans hadn't just passed one of the most extreme anti-public lands appropriations bill this Congress has ever seen. As a reminder, House Republicans proposed a cut of nearly $500 million from the National Park Service, voted to strip protections from the Grand Canyon, eliminated numerous programs designed to address environmental justice in frontline communities, and proposed additional across-the-board cuts that will make it nearly, if not impossible, for federal land management agencies to fulfill their missions. If we want to discuss threats to public land, the first place to look is the extreme MAGA policies that have hijacked the House of Representatives. When it comes to H.R. 5283, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are using Floyd Bennett Field in an attempt to divide our country and hide the truth about their record. Yes, it is true, Floyd Bennett Field is a component of the Gateway National Recreation Area, a unit of the National Park Service. And I know that parts of that field offer an escape and recreation to many New Yorkers. However, this is not the whole picture. Other parts of the site have a long history of hosting a variety of non-recreational uses, including training sites for New York Police Department, the New York Department of Sanitation. Floyd Bennett Field has also been utilized during several emergencies, for example, serving as the home base for rebuilding and restoration efforts following Superstorm Sandy in 2012. 10 years later, at the request of local government leaders from New York City and the governor of New York, it is being used to offer support during another national crisis. In return for the use of the site, New York City has agreed to invest millions to address deferred maintenance and improve visitor infrastructure at Floyd Bennett Field, something that has a clear benefit and connection to the mission of the Park Service. This hardly counts as turning America's best idea into its worst, and as has dramatically been suggested by the bill's proponents. I urge this committee to actually benefit national parks. And I urge us to return to truly addressing our broken immigration system. There is a right way to deal with this broken system, and there is a wrong way. And this is beginning the process of approaching this very critical, domestically sensitive and complex issue in the wrong way. But this bill does nothing to move us forward on either of those goals. Instead, it divides us and would make a humanitarian crisis that we have even worse. With that, I thank the committee, Mr. Chairman, for the time, and yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair will withhold questions at this time, and I'll go to our distinguished Vice Chairman, Dr. Burgess, for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification, are there people being housed right now on Floyd Bennett Field?
Our understanding is there's about 500 there now. There's capacity for 2,000.
And you mentioned tents. Are these canvas tents?
Yeah, they're metal frames with canvas. These things are massive. When I saw the pictures and the video, I was shocked to see how big they actually are. There's 7 tents. There's a tent for intake and processing where they actually speed up the asylum process. They give people medical exams, vaccinations. Then you have a tent for a cafeteria where they get hot food. And then you've got a recreation tent with televisions and those sort of things. And then you've got 4 tents for housing. You've got portable toilet facilities. You've got a laundry service. That's another thing. The migrants get their laundry done for them on this facility. And you also, there's several portable generators there, a lot of noise and a lot of fossil fuels being burned to generate the power for this big operation that's taking place on this Park Service land.
Now, are there neighborhoods close by? Do people live?
Yeah,
in the
the
vicinity?
information we got is that about 1 million people a year recreate or visit this Park Service unit. And when we were there on the visit, we asked the question, so how do you address the safety concerns with families with children out here playing on this park, recreating on this park, and then you've got single adult males being housed? Is it going to be fenced in with security guards? No, they're free to come and go as they please. But and I actually mentioned to one of the folks about, so they could walk out of the migrant facility, walk down the street, and be mingling with the families recreating on the park. And the person said, "Oh, that's a hypothetical."
So, yeah, it is a hypothetical, however,
Yeah,
but there's nothing to prevent it from happening.
absolutely nothing to prevent it from happening.
So let me ask you this. You mentioned the NEPA process. Is the committee in receipt of an environmental impact statement or environmental assessment that had been done for locating this facility in this place?
That was all waived within a matter of, my understanding was a week or less than 2 weeks, through the Council of Environmental Quality. The Biden administration waived everything with NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, NEPA. Ranking member talked about how the field was used during Hurricane Sandy, how it was used to stage people and equipment. But there's a difference. Hurricane Sandy was a declared national emergency, and the law provides for the president to waive environmental laws under declared national emergency. And I asked the question, has President Biden essentially declared his immigration policy a national emergency by waiving the environmental laws to build these migrant shelters on National Park Service land?
And what was the answer to your question?
They admitted they had waived the laws. They fast-tracked the permit.
Have they declared the emergency status?
They don't say that, but their actions show they have declared an emergency status.
Well, I actually wouldn't quibble with declaring an emergency over this. Figures I heard, in fact, over the weekend, since the Biden presidency began, there are 8 million people, both known and unknown, estimated 8 million people that have come in without the benefit of visas or social security numbers, non-citizens who've come into this country.
And the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, actually said this migrant crisis is going to, quote, ruin our city.
Well, 8 million people, just for context, that is the entire population of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, a rather densely populated part of my state. So basically, in 2.5 years' time, that population has been distributed somewhere within the border of the United States. And I actually don't disagree with Mayor Adams. I think it is a crisis in his community. I wish he had perhaps articulated that earlier, and it wasn't until Governor Abbott began helping people arrive at their final wished-for destination, and he realized he had to house all of these folks that are now showing up. But what he is dealing with is a mere fraction of what Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California are dealing with on a daily basis. Now, look, the ranking member mentioned comprehensive immigration reform. This is a problem of border security, not an immigration problem. It's a national security problem. 1986, there was an attempt with the Simpson-Mazzoli Act to say, well, we'll just legalize everyone who's here, and then, by golly, we'll do a good job from that day on and make sure our border is secure. But they didn't do it. It was just lip service to the fact that border security was going to be supplied. And I got to tell you, people I represent are sick of it. They don't believe, when they hear the phrase comprehensive immigration reform, they hear massive amnesty, and 8 million people in 2.5 years' time is the tangible evidence of that. Well, I appreciate what you're doing with the bill. I appreciate you bringing it to the Rules Committee today. I'll reserve any further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the ranking member for any questions he might have for the panel.
Yeah, I'm going to be very brief. It's just, it really kind of stinks to be back here when you look at what we're bringing to the floor. With all this going on in the world, with all this going on in our country, that this is what we're bringing to the floor. I mean, this is not a solution to anything. This is not dealing with the migrant situation, I would say to my friend from Texas, which is a lot more, which is complicated. I mean, as to why people are coming here to begin with, and some of the policies that the United States has been pursuing for quite some time in countries where migration is the highest. Maybe we ought to have a discussion about that. But what this is it's a messaging bill. It's a way to bash migrants. It's a way to drive a deeper wedge in this country. But it's not a solution to anything. And I just like, again, with with all that's happening, and this is the bills bills that we're bringing here today, not just this one, but the other. This is the urgent matter that we have to address right we come back from Thanksgiving. This is becoming a pretty discouraging place, not just because of the tone that we've seen in this chamber over the last several months, but the types of stuff that we're dealing with here. Again, it's not about helping anybody, not about solving problems. It's about trying to create political issues. And anyway, I think I will stop there because it's not worth any more time. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Minnesota for any questions she might have for our panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Westerman, I guess what I'm seeing is your committee looked into this, and we're doing a great amount of oversight and discovered this. I don't see this as bashing or an immigration issue. I see this as they were not following the law. You already talked a little bit about the NEPA kind of questionable issues that they had in order to put people there and emergency issues. And so I'm just wondering if you wanted to respond to that, this is a real issue. This is not bashing or political.
Yeah, the nonchalantness of our colleagues across the aisle on this issue, it's almost shocking when you look at what's actually happening here. And it reminds me of when we had a hearing on this bill, and we had Republicans and Democrats from New York City testifying in favor of this bill in our committee. And one of the Democrat members said it's just an old airport in Brooklyn. And, the people who live around this old airport in Brooklyn are outraged about what's happening. 1 million people a year recreate there. If you've been to New York City, there's not a whole lot of green space in New York City. And I always think, what if the shoe were on the other foot? What if this was a Republican administration waiving the, quote, bedrock environmental laws to build something on a National Park Service property? Do you think we would have a hearing about that? There would be outrage that some evil Republican was destroying our national parks. But now that it's the Biden administration doing it for illegal migrants, it seems to be just a messaging bill is what we've heard.
Yeah, and I agree, Mr. Westerman. I don't see this as a messaging bill. I see this as one where we are trying to make sure that they are following the law that is in place and making sure that we protect the public's lands. So, and with that, I support your bill, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania for any questions she might have for our witnesses.
Chair Grijalva, I don't get the impression that this bill does much, if anything, to address the underlying immigration issues that the country has to deal with here. Does it do anything to address the backlog or processing of asylum cases?
No, the issue of dealing with the crisis, the issue of beginning to address what is happening on our southern border and dealing with the realities that New York City and the state of New York came up with this proposal. Would it be one that all of us would have said this is the best idea? No, not necessarily. But there was no waiving of NEPA. There was no eliminating of that. There's the 30-page response to the issue was an emergency response. This was a national emergency response, and as it did for other situations that happened, Sandy being one and others. So there was, and it's kind of interesting that it's what really happened is the National Park Service revoked the same emergency process utilized for the restoration of the giant sequoias groves in California. And it's, it's amazing that Republicans want to codify that into an upcoming piece of legislation as a permanent fix. Mm-hmm. And yet on this emergency action, we want to completely eliminate the opportunities of any kind to provide relief at any time in the future. Yeah, and the issue of immigration, let me just say, there's a right way and a wrong way. I understand, and there isn't a person on our side of the aisle doesn't understand that dealing with immigration requires that you pay attention to security, that you pay attention to the existing undocumented in this country, and not talk about mass roundups and mass deportation and mass incarceration. And that we talk about what happens in the future and this refugee pressure that are we having on our country right now. How do we deal with that short term and long term? That requires compromise. That requires getting off the xenophobic rhetoric that we're hearing, the replacement theory, and how to gin up more and more hatred and division, and move in a direction that we deal with that comprehension. This bill is part of the platform for the dog whistles. It has nothing to do with NEPA. It has nothing to do. It has to do with a kickoff point to continue to bait and to batter the issue of immigration without ever coming up with a solution. It's Congress's responsibility, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to accept that responsibility other than these draconian issues that they put in front of this Congress time and time again. Doesn't solve the problem, but gins up potentially votes on their behalf.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Kentucky clearly used the break to do what I did and get a haircut. Clearly had a productive break. So with that, my friend's recognized for any questions he might have for the panel.
But I'm at a loss for words now, and I'll yield back on the question.
I'm going to try that line again.
You should have used it on me. I got a haircut.
Chair now recognizes my good friend from New Mexico for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and welcome to Chair Westerman and Ranking Member Grijalva. And Chair Westerman, I know how much you care about our public lands and our beautiful natural resources. You have done great work in that area. I'm pleased to be able to co-sponsor legislation with you about our public lands. I guess what strikes me is that there are two different sort of themes going through today's hearing, and one is the idea that we need to protect our public lands. One of my concerns is wondering how a $436 million cut to NPS and a National Park Service and a $255 million cut to BLM and the Republicans' Interior Appropriations Bill would provide our communities better access to public lands. Are you supportive of those cuts?
Thank the gentlelady from New Mexico for the question. I'm supportive of getting our fiscal house in order after the extreme run-up of the debt and the deficit spending during the last Congress and under the Biden administration. And if you look at how much spending was increased, only in Washington do you call putting the spending levels back down to where they were a couple of years ago a massive cut. So yes, I'm in support of getting our fiscal house in order. And that's going to seem painful in some areas, and some people will make it look like it's more painful than it actually is. But we've got $33 trillion in debt, and I know the gentleman didn't ask questions, but his debt clock is still over there running at record speed.
So thank you very much, Chairman. And you know, that comes up again and again as we're looking at some of these Republican bills. And what I go to again and again in response is that Republicans seem to want to get our fiscal house in order under Democrat presidents without looking at the fact that the deficit was caused in most part by Republican tax cuts, starting with tax cuts that go back, and then we had the Bush tax cuts, and then we had the Trump's tax cuts. And we actually have a great chart that I pull out sometimes when I'm on the floor. I can't pull it out here. We don't have the use of charts, but I can tell you that is the answer, that if we care about that, we need to go and look at some of those tax cuts and make sure that we don't continue them into the future. That would bring our fiscal house in order. The other thing, go on.
Well, about those tax cuts, I've heard that said over and over and over, so I went back and did some research on that. And if you look at the the CBO projections right after the tax cuts went in place, they were projecting a huge decrease in revenue. But if you actually go out and look at the revenue against what CBO projected, it was way above, I think it was about $700 billion above what CBO projected. I actually had a meeting with the CBO director, and he said, yeah, we missed that one. But that message has been repeated over and over and over, and I guess that if you say something long enough, people will believe it and the press will pick up on it. But if you actually look at the data, the tax cuts increased revenue to the federal government way above what CBO projected in their score when the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was being debated in Congress.
So I actually went and looked at that myself because I was curious because that is sometimes a response. And what we looked at was there were actually CBO projections, and the CBO projections were, before the tax cuts, were for revenue growth that was much higher. After the tax cuts, even though there was increased revenue, they were about, and I don't have the number right in front of me now, but I think I'm going to pull it up. It is about, well, I'm going to send that to you because it was several $100 million lower after the tax cuts. So the tax cuts did bring down revenue than what was projected.
And
So I
last
think
year,
part
we
of-
had $4.9 trillion in revenue, which was an all-time record, which exceeded the projections from CBO.
So, right, but they lowered the overall revenue that would have come in. And as an example, the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 increased the debt by $5.6 trillion. The Trump tax cuts increased the deficit by $2.3 trillion. The revenues were decreased by $1.9 trillion over 10 years. So we have this tension between how do we actually deal with protecting our natural resources, and do we do this on the backs of the beautiful land that we hold dear, or do we actually say the wealthy, the biggest corporations should pay their fair share? So that's the issue about the public lands and how do we invest in this wonderful treasure that we have. And then we move over to the issue that there are issues around migrants and immigration that we also haven't dealt with. And when I hear comprehensive immigration reform, I hear about $1.4 trillion in economic benefit to the United States. I also know that the supplemental that the president has presented has money to actually address the root causes. We need to go in and make sure that we stop and we intercept so we don't have as many migrants arriving at our borders. There is money in the supplemental. There is money that Democrats have talked about. How do we make sure we do that? How do we make sure that we also invest in the technology so that we're addressing fentanyl, which is coming in at the points of entry and not carried by asylums? That's another one of my favorite things to pull out, is the reports that say it's not asylum seekers that are bringing in fentanyl. It is actually a Cato Institute who has said it is at the ports of entry, it's United States citizens who are bringing in fentanyl. We need to address it. People in my community are dying. But there are key things that we can do around immigration to address these issues without sort of beating up on New York State because it asked to lease some land and creating the dog whistles that we've heard our ranking member speak to. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, the Gentlelady, Chair. I'll recognize the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Congressman Westerman. You know, this park was built in 1928, served a valuable use in World War II with the airplanes, with the Navy. When you do the math, you're talking about the national deficit. With the Park Service now, they're $11.1 billion in the red. And when you take New York City, the last time I heard the mayor, I think he was saying he's $50 billion short for his city because of migrants playing a big part of that, and the fact that they're a sanctuary city. They invited these migrants to come in. Who pays for the parks?
Well, obviously, the parks are part of the National Park Service, which is part of the federal government, so the American taxpayer funds the maintenance and upkeep of those parks.
So since 1928, the Americans have paid the bill for the parks to keep them up, maintain them. And
No,
then
actually since the 1800s on the national parks, but Floyd Bennett was moved to the Park Service, I believe, in the 70s. It was, as you mentioned, a naval station. I think Charles Lindbergh did flights out of there, but in the 70s, they put it as part of the Gateway National Recreation Area.
And you talking about, you know, having immigration, trying to manage immigration. This president has welcomed everybody anywhere without any checks and balances coming in this country to the tune of 8 million people. How does the president have the authority to make a lease that the federal that the taxpayers are paying for, and the migrants that are using it have not paid into the system? They came here illegally. How is he legally doing this?
That is a great question. It's something I've been trying to get answered, and I think Ranking Member Grijalva actually answered this in what he was saying earlier. The law provides under an emergency situation to waive a lot of rules, to waive NEPA, to waive the Endangered Species Act under an emergency. Now, he used the example of what the Park Service and the Forest Service is doing in the sequoia groves in California. Now, that's different. That is an emergency because of fire. Fire caused the emergency. There was talk about Hurricane Sandy, how everything was waived and the park was used during Hurricane Sandy. And I believe the ranking member said that the Biden administration has used those emergency powers to waive the rules for Floyd Bennett Field. So it's what I've said all along, that Joe Biden has declared an emergency over his border policies and the failed immigration and security in our country. Now, the administration, I don't think will go public and recognize that, but when you look at their actions, that's what they did. They declared an emergency, waived the rules, used emergency provisions so they could fast track building these migrant shelters on Park Service land in the city of New York.
So how is it fair to stop the people that have paid their fair share, as the left likes to say, to support parks, allowing those who have not paid a dime into it to overtake it? And what's happening to the people that want to use it now? How is that fair to them, to America?
Well, they're mad. There's been lawsuits filed. Like I said, we had Democrat elected officials that came to the committee and testified for the bill. And, you know, there's bipartisan resentment to what's happening in their Park Service property that, again, was referred to by a colleague across the aisle as just an old airport in Brooklyn. Now, I wonder if the Park Service thought that when they took it in as a recreation unit. I've got a national park in my hometown, and I would hate for somebody inside or outside of my hometown to call it just an old piece of property that's not worth much, because apparently somebody thought it was worth making a unit of the National Park Service at some point.
We've got Carowinds on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, and when you come in to use it, you pay a fee. What kind of fee are the migrants paying to use this national park?
There's no fee. I mean, they're getting all these services for free, and like I mentioned, the first busload that came up looked it over and thought, I guess the Roosevelt Hotel provided much better accommodations than the free housing and shelter and health care and food and laundry service they were going to get at Floyd Bennett Field. So they got on the bus and left.
And the cleanup of what you saw, they got porta pots set up?
They didn't have anything set up when I was there. They were just in the process of awarding the contracts and starting to move in. And so they hadn't started any construction when I was there, but I have seen videos and images from the migrant shelters since they've been constructed.
How's this not a sanitation issue?
Well, it's a fire hazard, and it is a sanitation issue, but they're using porta potties and those sort of things.
Which required, you got to service those. Who does the cleanup of all the trash? And
I think that's on the city of New York to take care of that. But we had an officer from the Park Service Police Union that came in and testified that they didn't have enough Park Service police officers to keep the place safe. So it's, I guess it's upon the city of New York to do security on the Park Service land, or they're just not going to have it.
And as you mentioned, the residents around it, not only they're being shut out from using it, they're going to be victims of crime, they're going to be victims of sanitation issues that you have. When you have a subdivision occupied by people, you have to put in certain things. This evidently doesn't have it. Does it have water lines to it?
I'm not sure about the water service, but I don't think it does have water lines. It is in a floodplain, though. It flooded just a week or so after we were up there. It's also got, there were signs out around where this shelter was going to be built about, I think it was native grasslands to stay off of it. You know, all of that just apparently through an emergency declaration by this administration got waved aside.
When it floods, sewage and whatever's on the ground floods into nearby neighborhoods.
Now, whatever's washing across the ground.
Well, I appreciate you bringing this up. This is a tragedy, really, New York City. A lot of it they invited among themselves by wanting a sanctuary city, but it's just adding to the national debt, and it's pretty much a crisis. This administration is inflicted on the American people. Thank you for bringing this up.
Thank you. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Grijalva for your testimony and for appearing before the committee today. I have great respect for Ranking Member Grijalva and for Chairman Westerman, both of whom I've partnered with, and having served as the Ranking Member and formerly the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Federal Lands in particular, have valued that partnership, and so I will preface my brief line of questioning with my thanks to both gentlemen for their work. Chairman Westerman, this is not your first time before the Rules Committee this year. You came earlier this year. Do you recall what subject you came to this committee on?
I believe I've been to the committee several times. I'm not sure which time you're talking about.
Well, so my understanding is you've been before the Rules Committee 3 times, but maybe I'm mistaken. This is the 3rd time. The first time you were before this committee was to push forward the CRA on the lesser prairie chicken, which I suspect you recall.
I agree with you on that.
All right, and then the second time that you and Ranking Member Grijalva graced us with your presence was on the long-eared bat. Do you remember that CRA as well?
I kind of thought those two were together, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, and
I think I've been here more times than that.
have you
as
been?
well.
Maybe I'm wrong. At least, and if that's the case, my apologies.
Yeah, because we did HR1, the lower
your staff
energy,
may,
the lower
HR1. That's right.
the Lower
first-
Energy Cost Act. We
That's
spent
right.
a lot
So
of time up here
four-
for that. Great bill, passed the House.
4 times.
Going nowhere in
HR1,
the Senate.
long-eared bat, lesser prairie chicken, and now a bill that
Yeah,
would
I think there's
revoke-
actually more times than that as well.
All right. Well, the last 3 times, let's say.
But you want to
long-eared
pick the
bat.
two where we talked about the long-eared bat and the prairie
Long-eared
chicken,
bat,
that's
lesser prairie
fine.
chicken, I didn't think those would come up again, but here we are. And now a bill that revokes a lease between the National Park Service and the city of New York for Floyd Bennett Field. And I guess you could probably surmise from my line of questioning, I just don't know that the American people would expect the Congress to be spending such an abundant amount of time on bills that revoke leases between cities and federal properties, or bills to express disapproval about placing a particular animal on the endangered species list, when there are such pressing challenges facing the country in terms of costs and growing the middle class and work that I think we all believe needs to be done by the Congress. And so it's not meant in a pejorative way about your leadership, Mr. Chairman, because you're not, the bills that you and the ranking member bring forward to this committee are obviously, the prioritization is that's made by the leadership of the House and by the Speaker. But it is simply to say that I think the priorities that the current Republican leadership is pursuing, in my view, is misplaced and isn't reflective, I think, of the concerns that most Americans are feeling. We just came back from a Thanksgiving break. We're here in Washington. Most of us returned today. And I think most members would like to be spending their time debating issues around growing the middle class and making the lives of Americans easier and not canceling leases between cities and federal departments. But you all have the majority, and so you choose to exercise your discretion in terms of deciding the prioritization.
And I would say I don't think the people who live around Floyd Bennett Field think this is something that we shouldn't be focusing on. I think when you look at the broader picture of federal lands and national parks across the country, that if America understood what was going on here, there would be more concern about it. I actually think, like I said earlier,
I'm not so sure that most folks in Arkansas or in Colorado are thinking about Floyd Bennett Field. I think
Well,
they're
but
figuring
I think-
out how to heat their homes and how to feed their children.
which is a crisis because, energy's so high, the cost of food's so high. They are thinking about a lot of other things. But this question has come up, I believe, in this committee before about, it's kind of phrased as, why are you focused on something so silly? And my response is because this administration did something that demands a response. Now, they were the ones that did the silly thing to start with by putting migrant shelters on National Park Service land in the middle of New York City. So are we just supposed to stand by and say, oh, go ahead, that's a crazy thing? I think as chairman of the committee and as Congress's role to have oversight over the administration, this is an important issue that's definitely important to Representative Malliotakis, to other members in that immediate area. And I went there and talked to the citizens in that area, and it's an important issue to them as well.
I will leave it there. Ranking Member Grijalva, if you'd like to.
Yeah, a little bit about the crocodile tears. The presence of these asylum seekers and those seeking refugee status in this country, it is an issue that is different because of the asylum law and international law. They present themselves, and the process then kicks in. And through the Trump administration and the inability to rebuild that as quickly as it's needed in terms of resources, the backlog, the elimination of staff that does that, the courtrooms, the judicial side, the processing side, the cash management side, that is credible fear is there, then status would be granted. If not, then that's another process, and they're not eligible. But we're not going through that process. We're waiting for that process to occur. The crocodile tears I speak about is the deal with public lands. Since I got to this Congress, I wanted to be on this committee. And because of the unifying factor that this committee has for the American people. Its parks, its lands. And to interject an issue as difficult, complex, and polarizing as the issue of immigration reform with no context and no solution other than to rail about it is wrong. And to interject it into this discussion on a jurisdiction that has been bipartisan and is a unifying factor in this country, I think is sad. The crocodile tears is my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to expedite as much drilling for as little price and the minimum amount of royalties on our public lands, irrespective. Isn't that a danger to the integrity and the sanctity of those public lands? Oh, frontline communities, environmental justice community. Those communities, it's a social issue. It's not really an environmental issue. That's what you hear. And yet those can be collateral damage, and we only care about a neighborhood if that issue happens to coincide with the issue that we're trying to promote, i.e. the migrants and i.e. this airfield. You know, I think these crocodile tears need to be examined, but we're not examining that. We're opening a discussion up on the issue of immigration that'll be with us too long in this Congress with no solution, because it is about polls, it's about the election in 2024, and how this issue can be the Republicans feel can be an important factor for them. Well, I don't think so. And this is why we're dragged into this discussion today, Mr. Nagus, on an issue that should be not separate, but that the Resources Committee shouldn't be the point of the spear on this ugly debate that's forthcoming and continues to be on the issue of immigration and migrants in this country. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Ranking Member Grijalva for, I think, articulating that so well. And, you know, I would say, at the risk of quoting a fellow member, there's a gentleman from Texas, a member of this distinguished committee, dare I say a wise man, who went to the floor 2 weeks ago and asked the House to, quote, explain to me one material, meaningful, significant thing the Republican majority has done. I agree. And apparently, you know, the advocacy for Floyd Bennett Field could be added to the list, I guess, of the things that the Republican majority has spent their time on this last 10 months. I think there are other issues, pressing issues that we ought to be debating, including immigration policy. But I guess we'll have to leave that for another day on the Rules Committee. So with that, I'll yield to the gentlewoman from New Mexico for a moment.
Thank you very much. And I think that the ranking member's point about the need to look seriously at addressing immigration reform is really important. And that when we see bill after bill that doesn't look at the substance and doesn't look at that issue, we are reminded that there is a desire to use immigration and immigrants as political footballs and as cudgels, and as the ranking member mentioned, to sort of elicit divisiveness and oftentimes hatred, unfortunately, as we have seen people of my community gunned down because they are Latinos and immigrants. And Republicans have over and over again thwarted attempts to actually solve the issue. During President Bush's presidency, Republicans blocked their own president's immigration legislation. In 2013, House Republicans blocked the Senate's bipartisan immigration bill that would have done what you guys are saying you want, which would have attract workers from all over the world, devoted unprecedented resources for security along the border, as well as allowing the millions of undocumented workers to have a path, not a guaranteed, but a path to citizenship and to be able to work here. And we are dealing with a labor crisis right now, and addressing immigration in a clear-headed way would address that. Last Congress, Senate Republicans blocked bipartisan passage. We passed out of the House the Dream and Promise Act, the Farm Labor Workforce Modernization Act, and we couldn't get Republicans in the Senate to pass it. Those were bipartisan bills. All of these efforts have been bipartisan, but reasonable Republicans will join us in solving this crisis. But as long as they want to turn it into Biden's problem, it's not Biden's problem. It's a problem that is presenting itself at the border, and because Congress does not act, it's Congress's problem. Congress has failed us on this issue. Congress has failed, and we need Republicans to join with Democrats to solve this problem, not to just turn it into a cudgel. And thank you for the time, and I yield back my time to you.
I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Well, I thank the chairman, and I thank both you gentlemen for coming here to testify before the Rules Committee. I hope you had great Thanksgivings. I would note that there's an important phrase left out from my remarks on the floor of the House, which is the phrase that comes on the back end of the question about the meaningful, significant thing the Republican majority has done besides, quote, well, I guess it's not as bad as the Democrats, end quote. The fact of the matter is, what the American people are frustrated about is the uniparty in this town. The fact that this entire Congress, the previous Congress, the previous 217 Congresses, have done nothing but make this country weaker, with more debt, with less ability to have freedom as we pile up laws and regulations around the heads of the American people and constrain them. Yet, ignore our fundamental duty to actually defend a sovereign nation. That's the actual truth. The gentleman from Arizona referred to crocodile tears. Well, I'm sorry, but I do shed some tears for the people that I represent that are being absolutely decimated by open borders. The young man yesterday morning in a coffee shop in Austin, Texas, who grew up in Laredo and lives in San Antonio, is a constituent of mine who lives near the airport in San Antonio, who came up talking about family members of his who have died, who have been had their lives upended, had their ranches upended, talking about single adult males coming into this country. The videos that I was shown by members of the Texas State Legislature just this last Friday at a football game, pulling me aside and saying, what can you do to stop this? We are begging for help. We are desperate for help, showing me videos of people running away from Border Patrol, single adult males. And if 2023, if you are running away from Border Patrol, you are up to no good. I assure you, you are up to no good. And that's the actual reality of what we're dealing with on the ground. Speaker of the House in Texas came up to me and said, "Man, we got $13 billion, we're in on this. $13 billion the state of Texas is in on and having to deal with the border crisis. Now, Texas, thankfully, has a fraction of our state devoted to federal lands, something like 1.x%. You know, basically, we got Big Bend and nothing else. And the fact is, though, Texas is under siege. Under Operation Lone Star in the state of Texas, we've had 435,700 illegal immigrant apprehensions by our own Texas authorities, 34,000 criminal arrests, 30,900 felony charges. We've seized over 428 million lethal doses of fentanyl. We have, yes, bused 11,300 migrants to Washington, 13,500 migrants to New York City, 7,000 to Chicago, 2,600 to Philadelphia, 1,100 to Denver, 480 to LA. Yes, we have done that. That is a fraction of the 435,000 apprehensions we have had, or the $13 billion that we've had to spend in Texas in order to do the job of the federal government. It is the state of Texas, and I would add the state of Arizona, New Mexico, California, but particularly the state of Texas and Arizona, Tucson in particular, left holding the bag. That's the truth. And I would ask the gentleman from Arkansas if he agrees that the purpose of this legislation is to deal with the fact that we've got one of our colleagues from New York, and we obviously have a colleague from New York here, but unfortunately he's not at the dais at the moment, that is dealing with the repercussions of what they're dealing with in New York. And they're trying to figure out what they're doing with individuals. And now this agreement is struck. And that raises questions from a federal standpoint. And I wonder if the gentleman can expand on that and why it's so critically important to our friends from New York that we deal with this.
Yeah, as I said in my testimony, this was brought to my attention by Representative Maliotakis, who, when she told me what was happening, I thought there must be some mistake. They're not going to build migrant shelters on federal land. Surely there's other land somewhere in the state of New York, because it was the governor of New York that came to the Biden administration asking for help in taking care of all these illegal migrants that were coming into the state because of their sanctuary city laws. So, as you said, it's a fraction of the number of migrants that you're dealing with in Texas, but the local representation at the city, the state, and in Congress are all feeling the repercussions of the actions of the mayor, the governor, and the president of the United States in their local area.
One quick question. If I'm correct, in March of 2021, early in the administration of the current president, you and a colleague of yours of ours from Arizona, Representative Gosar, sent a letter to Secretary Mayorkas about the environmental related concerns about the border crisis. One of the points raised in the letter was deserts along the southern border being used as dumping grounds and vegetation in the area being destroyed by migrants. First of all, did you ever get a response from the administration on that letter?
No, they seem to want to ignore that. And I think the statistic I've heard is 8 or 9 pounds of trash per migrant. So multiply that times 8 million, and that tells you how much trash has been dumped along the border. I know you've seen it in your area. It's amazing the heaps and piles of trash that gets discarded when they come across the border. And some of this is on federal land. And then you have the devastation that's happening further across the border. We have cartels that are growing marijuana on Forest Service land in California and other places. And there's a lot of devastation that's happening to our federal lands directly related to the failure to secure the southern border.
Right, I've got a stat here that I was just looking up about an estimate, conservative estimate showing more than 500 tons of trash being left behind by illegal border crossers each year in the Buenos Aires sector out in Arizona. And frankly, that's an old data point. It's not even updated. I could go find a more updated data point, but we frankly never get really good responses out of the administration when we ask the questions, because frankly, the administration has no interest in providing that information because it would be devastating. And the gentleman, he can respond if he wants, from Arizona, talks about this being a political point, that the only reason that we're raising this issue is for a political gain in an election year. Well, I've been in Congress for 5 years and have been talking about this under both administrations, about the need to do what we need necessary to secure the border. And I can assure you that there are no crocodile tears here that are not being directed towards the people that are having their lives devastated and turned upside down by wide open borders. And I can assure you that it is not a political reality. And I wonder if the gentleman from Arkansas thinks, your constituents or constituents and people across the country, do you view this as something that is critical from a election year messaging perspective, or a perspective of making sure that our people are actually secure and safe from dangerous cartels, from dangerous criminals, from people that can come in here with wide open borders, from fentanyl pouring in, but also just the absolute devastation of the volume, just the simple volume, if the gentleman wants to respond.
And the bill is about protecting our federal lands. The immigration crisis is mingled in with that. And, I was talking about the cartels growing dope on federal lands. They also use pesticides and herbicides that you would get thrown under the jail if you were using those for agriculture production here in the U.S. I think about the federal land in my state. If I were to go out and throw 8 or 9 pounds of trash on the ground,
Right.
I don't think I would get off scot-free from that. I don't think any American citizen would, nor should they. But we seem to turn a blind eye because this is happening with illegal immigrants. And another stat that a lot of people don't realize is that about 40% of the southern border is federal land.
And that is true. And again, we have Big Bend, but the vast majority of the Texas border is not federal land. But it's a significant problem. Another question about the federal lands. If federal lands are now going to be used by the administration as effectively a bailout in order to place migrants from cities that are overwhelmed, then is that not a greater pull factor then for more migrants to come, particularly when the laws involving asylum, parole are being stretched well beyond their legal intent, in fact, in violation of the law, to attract millions of people to rush the southern border? Will not the placement of migrants who have come here and are being released into the United States, an automatic entry program, that's what the Biden administration has in place, is an automatic entry program, that they will be placed onto federal lands, will that not increase the pull factor of the people coming to the southern border claiming asylum and seeking parole?
And it seems like everything this administration does is to increase that pull factor. And you think about this migrant shelter, it has food, housing, and they do your laundry for you. If that's not a pull factor for people to come here, along with all the other pull factors for people to come here, I don't know what would be. And the ranking member talked about, and this is something we heard on our visit to Floyd Bennett, how the city of New York was going to pay the Park Service a lot of money for this lease, and they will be able to reinvest it into the Park Service unit to make the facility better in the future. And I thought, what if a Republican president wanted to lease out some of Yellowstone to some corporation that would pay Yellowstone some money so they could go in and make the experience better for the future? Would our friends across the aisle have a problem with that? But the precedent's been set here now in New York that this can actually be a fundraising exercise for the Park Service to get more funding to make the experience better in the future.
I think, but gentlemen, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And the lady from Indiana is recognized for any questions she may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Grijalva for coming to the Rules Committee to testify. I appreciate that our Natural Resource Committee colleagues are here with us, but I've got to admit the fact that you are here on this issue is disappointing. We're here in principle to discuss the tragedy at our southern border and this administration's inability or unwillingness to solve the problem. We've passed a solution to this 2 months ago in H.R. 2. We have passed that bill to deal with our border crisis. And instead of passing that legislation, it's sitting in the Senate, and the President have failed to act. We've heard our colleagues say that this isn't Biden's problem. This is a problem that Republicans need to come together with Democrats to support and solve, but we've been trying to solve this issue since we first started in January with H.R. 2. I visited the border and talked with Border Patrol agents who said President Trump's plan to secure the border was working. He had a plan to invest in infrastructure, in technology, in personnel. He had the Remain in Mexico policy, and it was working until Biden came into office and pushed pause on those plans and then shifted those plans into reverse faster than you can say crocodile tears. This, as my colleague from Texas, Representative Roy, has pointed out repeatedly and passionately and eloquently, and if I were a representative of Texas, I would no doubt feel the pressure that he feels from his constituencies, and I feel pressure from constituents in Indiana. I have said before that every state is a border state, and Indiana is a border state, and New York now is evidently also a border state. So we have to solve this issue, but it starts with securing the border. We're here with the chairman and the ranking member of a committee with primary jurisdiction over federal lands and natural resources. Important committees and topics, but generally unrelated to immigration and national security or homeland security. But we're here because particularly New York State and some states have been considering housing migrants on federal lands. Mr. Chairman, I want to read to you the mission of the National Park Service is to preserve the natural and cultural resources and values of the National Park System for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. Chairman Westerman, does the plan to lease property to house illegal immigrants in New York at the Floyd Bennett Field, does it fulfill that mission as stated by the National Park Service?
I don't think in anybody's wildest imagination they could make the connection of that. When Abraham Lincoln essentially started the Park Service, I don't think he was envisioning that. When Teddy Roosevelt created a lot of national parks along with Congress, I don't think they were envisioning that. This is something new. It's the Biden administration's legacy for our National Park Service.
And to be clear, it is because of the Biden administration's disaster border policies that New York in particular has seen the arrival of more than 118,800 illegal immigrants. Housing for these individuals is predicted to cost roughly $12 billion over the next 3 years. This shelter would propose to house as many as 2,000 illegal immigrants. I visited a rancher when I was in Texas and saw the property that he owns, where 4 acres at least of his property, where he sees daily between 1,000 and 4,000 crossings of illegal migrants a day, daily crossings, have turned his property into just barren wasteland. Looks like a landfill. And it is vegetation that has turned to dust. Does that sound like it's a good idea for the preservation of our national park system?
It's definitely not a model we want to carry to our national parks, but you go to Big Bend and you go to Oregon Pipes and other federal lands along the border, and you'll see some of the same things. It's a lot more out of sight and out of mind than it is in the heart of Brooklyn, where this Park Service unit is. But this is straying very far from the purpose and the mission of the Park Service.
Thank you. And so I want to talk about some of your primary concerns, Mr. Chairman, if the federal lands are used for this purpose, why do those concerns of yours and ours that we share, why do they require this action today?
Because we have oversight over the administration. And I think they're abusing the law. They're using the emergency declarations for an emergency that they created. This isn't a natural disaster. It's not a hurricane. It's not a forest fire. It's not a flood. It's a man-made problem that this administration is solely responsible for. And you talked about the numbers in the previous administration. We're now seeing 160-plus people on the terrorist watch list that have been stopped at the southern border. How many came across the southern border? How many tons of fentanyl does it take before we decide to go close the southern border? The border crisis is everywhere in America now. And what's happening at Floyd Bennett Field highlights the failure at the southern border.
I totally agree. I thank you for saying that. I had a colleague recently say, you know, with the number of people who have crossed the border illegally, even if just 1% were members of terrorist organizations, it could be up to 15,000 people that are here, that are from terrorist organizations within the United States following the Biden administration's policy failures. And this is just one more policy failure, in my opinion, in trying to address this problem. We have to secure the border. I will join my colleague from Texas in that fight every day of the week. I appreciate your comments, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thanks for both members for coming in. But with that, Mr. Chairman, for the sake of time, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from New York is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the time. Chairman Westerman, I'm the sole member of this panel that's from the state of New York, and I'm absolutely appalled with this administration, in conjunction with the state of New York and New York City, that they have perpetrated on the taxpayers of our state. The encampment of illegal migrants on land never meant for such purposes at just absolute enormous expense to U.S. taxpayers. It does nothing to address the core problems that have led to millions of people pouring across our southern border illegally, entering this country and violating our nation's sovereignty. To echo my colleagues who have already spoken very passionately and at length today, these policies are in no way humanitarian or benevolent. This administration is actually hurting the very people it claims to be protecting here. Chairman Westerman, as you know, the Biden administration has stated that this legislation, H.R. 5283, prevents the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture from making appropriate use of federal land for emergency purposes. Once more, could you remind us, is the encampment of thousands of illegal migrants on the grounds of a historic landmark an appropriate use of federal lands and resources?
I say it's not. The Biden administration obviously says it does, and they're using the authorities they have under an emergency declaration to use the federal land, the Park Service land, to house migrants.
Absolutely. And for that matter, do you think it's appropriate to use hotels and public school gyms in communities like New York City and in small communities in my own district to house illegal immigrants?
So I would say that's more a decision for the state of New York and the city of New York. I did try to visit the Roosevelt Hotel and was asked to leave, even though there were uniformed National Guard members at the hotel. They said this was a city operation, and even though several members on the other side of the aisle toured the hotel with cameras the week before, we were denied entrance into the Roosevelt Hotel. I'm more concerned about the federal land, Floyd Bennett Field, and this unprecedented action that the administration has taken that unfortunately sets a precedent for the future for who knows what with our federal lands.
No, and I appreciate that, and I'm not surprised you weren't granted any transparency by, New York City and New York State government officials when you wanted to see exactly how our tax dollars were being spent as a federal legislator. This is not only an inappropriate use of taxpayer resources and lands. Isn't this all just completely avoidable in a direct product of the administration's border policies?
Yeah, I get asked, how do you stop these actions from happening. The root cause is the number of migrants coming across the southern border, and it's, you can call me Captain Obvious, I guess, but I think everybody that has a slight sense of reasoning can figure that out.
Yeah, I think the people at home are just shaking their head while they see the footage of what's happening in America's cities and they see the footage at the border, and they just scratch their head as to why isn't the administration doing the obvious, which is just shutting down the border. But thank you very much, Chairman. I appreciate you reiterating these points for us today, because we cannot just act like this is an inevitable and unavoidable flood of illegal migration when we know for a fact that it's this administration and the sanctuary policies of Governor Kathy Hochul in New York and Mayor Adams in New York City. They are directly responsible for the mess that New Yorkers, like my own constituents, New York State taxpayers, are stuck to deal with. And I'd like to also address the repeated claims by colleagues on the other side of the aisle that this legislation is cruel or callous or inhumane or whatever other adjective that they'd like to use. To quote a recent article on the encampment of illegal migrants at Floyd Bennett Field, it was reported that, quote, parents say they swaddle their children in bed sheets but can't stop them from shivering through the night as they tried to fall asleep in tents. This is just one small glimpse at a completely avoidable humanitarian disaster, wrought not by big bad Republicans in the House, but by an administration that refuses to enforce our immigration laws and has flung the door wide open at our southern border. Children should not be shivering in the night at Floyd Bennett Field in New York City. And they wouldn't be if this administration and Democrats in New York and other so-called sanctuary states and cities would acknowledge the true harm and destruction that their policies have brought on Americans and immigrants alike. I strongly support this legislation before us today. I urge all my colleagues to do the same. And Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to yield back.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of our witnesses for appearing today. We appreciate your testimony, and you're each excused.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I thought it was part of a sitcom for a while.